The sun rose on April 28, 1503, over a small vineyard near the town of Cerignola in southern Italy, and with it rose something that would change warfare forever. In less than 4 hours, gunpowder would prove it could kill faster than courage could advance. Arquebus fire would shatter the myth of knightly invincibility. And a defensive ditch barely 6 feet deep would become the grave of French chivalry. What happened in that vineyard wasn't just a battle. It was the future arriving with the sound of thunder, and the past dying in volleys of lead and smoke. The medieval world ended here. And most of the men who died that morning never understood why. You need to understand the Italy of 1503. For a decade, the peninsula had been the playground of foreign kings who treated it like a prize to be divided. French armies marched south. Spanish armies marched north. German mercenaries sold their services to the highest bidder. Italian city-states switched allegiances based on who seemed strongest that particular month. The Italian Wars, as historians would later call this 50-year nightmare, turned one of Europe's most prosperous regions into a perpetual battlefield where the only constant was suffering. Villages burned. Crops were seized. Entire populations fled ahead of armies that saw civilians as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be removed. But by the spring of 1503, the chaos had begun to crystallize into something more focused. The Kingdom of Naples, that wealthy territory controlling southern Italy, had become the main prize. France claimed it through dynastic inheritance. Spain claimed it through older, more complex legal arguments that involved Aragonese kings and papal endorsements. What mattered wasn't the legitimacy of these claims but the raw fact that two of Europe's emerging superpowers had decided Naples was worth fighting for, and neither was willing to back down. The Spanish forces in southern Italy were commanded by a man whose name would echo through military history for centuries, Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba. They called him El Gran Capitan, the Great Captain, though in 1503 that title was still being earned rather than simply acknowledged. Gonzalo was in his early 50s, an age when most commanders of his era had either retired or died. But he possessed something rare, a mind that understood warfare was changing. The tactics that had dominated European battlefields for 300 years, massed cavalry charges, heavily armored knights, the shock of noble horsemen crashing into infantry lines, were becoming obsolete. Gonzalo knew this because he'd seen it happen. He'd fought in Granada during the final campaigns against the Moorish kingdom, where Spanish forces had learned to combine different types of troops in new ways, where firearms had begun to prove their worth, where fortifications and defensive positions had defeated cavalry repeatedly. As historian Geoffrey Parker notes in his analysis of the military revolution, Gonzalo understood that the future of warfare belonged to whoever could best integrate new technologies with traditional tactics. The arquebus, that clumsy shoulder-fired weapon that took 30 seconds to reload and frequently misfired, seemed like a poor replacement for the crossbow or longbow to most commanders. But Gonzalo saw its potential. Not as a replacement for everything that came before, but as one element in a system where infantry, cavalry, artillery, and firearms worked together in ways no single weapon type could match. The Spanish army under Gonzalo's command in April 1503 numbered around 6,000 men. Not a massive force by the standards of the Italian wars, but it was experienced, disciplined, and loyal. The corps consisted of Spanish infantry, many of them veterans of the Granada campaigns. These weren't feudal levies or impressed peasants. They were professional soldiers who'd been fighting together for years, who trusted their commanders, and who understood that survival depended on maintaining formation and following orders even when every instinct screamed to run. Alongside them fought smaller contingents of German Landsknechts, those feared mercenaries whose reputation for brutality was matched only by their effectiveness in close combat. The Spanish also had cavalry, though not as much as they would have liked, and a few pieces of artillery that were more useful for psychological effect than actual battlefield impact. The French army advancing toward Cerignola was larger and, on paper, more impressive. Louis d'Armagnac, Duke of Nemours, commanded approximately 8,000 men, including the pride of French military power, heavy cavalry. These were armored nobles and professional men-at-arms, mounted on horses bred for size and strength, equipped with lances and swords, trained from childhood in the art of mounted combat. The French cavalry had dominated European battlefields for generations. They were the descendants of the knights who'd fought at Crécy and Agincourt, though those battles should have taught France something about the dangers of unsupported cavalry charges against prepared defensive positions. But military institutions have long memories for their successes and short memories for their failures. The French also fielded Swiss pikemen, considered the finest infantry in Europe. These men fought in dense formations called pike squares, their 18-foot pikes creating a forest of sharp points that could stop cavalry and devastate other infantry. The Swiss had spent decades building their reputation through victories against Burgundian knights and German armies. They were expensive, they were proud, and they were absolutely convinced of their own superiority. Alongside these elite units, the French had their own arquebusiers, artillery, and various supporting troops. But numbers and equipment don't tell the full story. You need to feel the psychological state of these armies on the morning of April 28th. The Spanish were defending. They'd spent the previous day and night preparing positions near Cerignola, digging trenches, building earthworks, positioning their limited artillery. They knew the French were coming. They knew they were outnumbered. But they had the advantage of choosing the ground and preparing it. Gonzalo had selected a position just outside Cerignola with careful attention to terrain. The ground sloped gently, giving his forces a mild elevation advantage. More importantly, he'd ordered his men to dig a ditch and pile the excavated earth into a rampart. This wasn't a massive fortification, nothing like the walls of a city or the elaborate defenses of a major fortress. Contemporary accounts, including those analyzed by historian Michael Mallet, describe earthworks perhaps 6 feet deep with a corresponding rampart of similar height. Simple, hastily constructed, but enough to break up an advancing formation and slow a cavalry charge. The French, by contrast, were attacking. They'd been pursuing the Spanish for days, trying to bring them to battle, and now they'd finally cornered Gonzalo's army. The mood in the French camp that morning was probably confident, possibly even eager. They outnumbered the Spanish. They had superior cavalry. And they were fighting for their king's honor and their own glory. Medieval and Renaissance warfare placed enormous emphasis on personal courage and aggressive action. Defensive fighting was often seen as cowardly or at least less honorable than bold attacks. The French commanders likely looked at the Spanish earthworks and saw them as confirmation that their enemies were afraid that this would be a victory. What neither side fully understood yet was that they were about to participate in a transition point. Military historians mark Cerignola as one of the first major battles where field fortifications and coordinated firearms fundamentally changed how European armies fought. The techniques Gonzalo would employ this day, using earthworks to protect infantry, positioning arquebusiers behind cover where they could reload safely, coordinating different troop types to support each other, these would become standard practice within a generation. But on April 28, 1503, they were still experimental, still unproven in major battle. As dawn broke and the French army formed up for their attack, you could hear the metal. Thousands of men adjusting armor, checking weapons, the percussion of an army preparing for combat. Officers shouted orders in French, Italian, German, Spanish. Horses snorted and stamped. Somewhere in the Spanish lines, an arquebusier checked his powder for the 10th time, knowing that when the moment came, he'd have one shot before needing to reload. Somewhere in the French lines, a knight adjusted his helmet and thought about glory. Neither of them knew they were about to collide in a battle that would be studied for centuries. The morning air carried the smell of trampled vineyard earth mixed with metal and leather and human sweat. The Spanish lines had been awake since before dawn, not from orders but from the nervous energy that precedes combat. Men checked and rechecked their equipment with the obsessive attention soldiers develop when they know death might come from a single mistake. An arquebus that misfires. A pike shaft that cracks. Armor straps that come loose at the wrong moment. These small failures killed men as surely as enemy swords, and everyone knew it. Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba moved along the Spanish positions with the practiced calm of a commander who understood that soldiers watched their leaders for signs of fear or confidence. Contemporary accounts, pieced together by historian John Hale from various sources, describe El Gran Capitan as a man who inspired loyalty through competence rather than charisma. He didn't give grand speeches about glory or honor. Instead, he explained his plans clearly, positioned his troops carefully, and demonstrated through his actions that he valued their lives enough to use them intelligently. This morning he walked the line of earthworks, speaking quietly with unit commanders, adjusting positions, ensuring the arquebusiers understood their firing sequences and the pikemen knew when to advance or hold. The defensive position Gonzalo had prepared revealed his tactical thinking. The ditch and rampart weren't designed to stop the French army. They were designed to disrupt it, to break up formations, to create those crucial moments of chaos where a coordinated defense could inflict maximum damage on a disorganized attack. Behind the earthworks, he positioned his arquebusiers in the center, perhaps 1,300 men carrying those crude firearms that represented the future of warfare even if most people didn't realize it yet. To their flanks, he'd placed his pikemen and other infantry, roughly 3,000 soldiers with various weapons and armor qualities. The Spanish cavalry, outnumbered and unable to match the French heavy horse in direct combat, were held in reserve behind the main line. This wasn't cowardice. It was calculation. Gonzalo knew his cavalry would be most effective not in the initial clash but in exploiting whatever opportunities the battle created. The artillery, such as it was, had been positioned to support the earthworks. Renaissance artillery was still primitive by later standards. The guns were heavy, difficult to move once positioned, prone to mechanical failure, and their accuracy was more hopeful than reliable. But they could create smoke, noise, and occasionally they could kill. More importantly, the sound of artillery fire had psychological effects that went beyond the actual casualties inflicted. Men who'd never heard cannon fire before often broke formation at the first thunderous blast. Even experienced soldiers felt their heart's rate increase when they heard the deep boom that signaled incoming shot. Across the field, perhaps 600 yards away, the French army was deploying. You feel the confidence in their movements. This was an army that had won battles before, that had some of the finest cavalry in Europe, that outnumbered the enemy and held the initiative. The Duke of Nemours, Louis d'Armagnac, commanded from horseback surrounded by his noble captains. French military culture in 1503 still operated on principles inherited from feudal warfare. Noble cavalry were the decisive arm. Infantry existed to support them or hold ground they'd won. The ideal battle was one where armored horsemen charged and shattered the enemy through shock and superior fighting skill. This mindset had deep roots in French military tradition, going back centuries to when the knight on horseback represented the pinnacle of military effectiveness. But the Duke faced a decision that would determine everything. How to attack the Spanish position. The earthworks were visible from the French lines, modest but clearly present. Some of his advisors likely argued for caution, for probing attacks or attempting to flank the position. Others probably advocated for a direct assault, relying on French cavalry superiority to overwhelm the defensive works through sheer momentum. As historian Bert Hall notes in his analysis of early modern warfare, Renaissance commanders often struggled with the question of how aggressive to be when facing new defensive tactics. Traditional military wisdom emphasized offensive action and personal courage. but traditional wisdom was encountering weapons and techniques that didn't respect old rules. The Duke of Nemours chose aggression. Perhaps he felt the political pressure to deliver a decisive victory. Perhaps he genuinely believed his cavalry could break through any earthwork that hadn't had months to construct. Perhaps he simply couldn't imagine his armored nobles being stopped by a hastily dug ditch and some Spanish infantry. Whatever his reasoning, the order went out: the French would attack directly, using their cavalry to lead the assault and break the Spanish line. The French cavalry that formed up for the attack represented an enormous concentration of wealth and military power. Each armored horseman had spent years training for mounted combat. The horses themselves were expensive animals, bred specifically for war, trained to charge into combat despite their natural flight instincts. The armor worn by these men cost more than a peasant family would earn in multiple lifetimes. Plate metal had to be custom fitted, maintained constantly, replaced when damaged. The lances they carried were specialized weapons that required significant skill to use effectively from horseback. This was an elite force in every sense of the word, and they knew it. Behind the cavalry came the Swiss pikemen, moving in their characteristic dense formations. These men fought as a collective entity. Individual Swiss soldiers were effective, but the pike square's power came from maintaining formation no matter what happened. As long as the square held together, with hundreds of 18-foot pikes pointing in all directions, it was nearly invincible in close combat. Cavalry couldn't charge it effectively. Other infantry couldn't break through the forest of pike points. The Swiss had built their entire military reputation on this formation's effectiveness, and they'd spent decades proving that reputation on battlefields across Europe. The French arquebusiers and other infantry moved in support of these main striking forces. In French tactical thinking, these troops were important but secondary. The battle would be won by cavalry shock and Swiss pike formations. The firearms were useful for skirmishing and supporting the main assault, but nobody expected them to be decisive. As the French army completed its deployment, a strange quiet settled over the battlefield. That moment before combat begins when men stand ready, waiting for orders, feeling the weight of what's about to happen. Officers checked their lines one final time. Soldiers shifted their grips on weapons and tried to control their breathing. Some prayed silently. Others focused on the mechanical details of their equipment, finding comfort in familiar routines. Fear was present in both armies, though it manifested differently. The French felt the fear that comes before aggressive action, that mixture of anxiety and adrenaline that actually enhances performance if channeled correctly. The Spanish felt the fear that comes from waiting to be attacked, knowing the enemy will choose the timing and initial point of contact. Gonzalo gave final instructions to his arquebusiers. Wait for the command. Don't fire individually. Aim low, at the mass of advancing troops rather than trying to pick specific targets. Reload as quickly as possible behind the protection of the earthworks. These weren't revolutionary instructions, but they reflected an understanding of how firearms worked in early 16th century combat. Individual accuracy was less important than volume of fire. A single arquebus ball might miss or wound one man. 100 arquebus balls fired simultaneously into a dense formation would inevitably find targets. The morning sun climbed higher. The temperature rose slightly, though the April air remained cool. And then, sometime around 9 or 10 in the morning, contemporary sources don't provide exact times, the French cavalry began to advance. Not at a gallop, not yet. The initial movement was almost casual, closing the distance between the armies at a trot. The ground between the two positions wasn't perfectly flat. There were slight rises and depressions, patches of harder and softer earth, scattered vegetation from the vineyards that dominated this region. None of these obstacles were significant individually, but collectively they meant cavalry couldn't build maximum speed and momentum until they were relatively close to the Spanish lines. You hear the advance before the visual details become clear. Hundreds of horses moving together create a sound that's more felt than heard, a low rumbling that vibrates through the ground. Metal clinks and rattles as armor plates shift with movement. Voices call out, though from this distance the words are indistinguishable. The Spanish soldiers behind their earthworks watched the cavalry come closer. Every man who'd faced cavalry charges before knew what would happen next. The horses would accelerate. The neat lines would compress into a thundering mass. The ground would shake. And then steel-tipped lances would be coming at them faster than a man could run, backed by half-done horses and armored riders trained to kill. Gonzalo's voice cut through the tension in the Spanish lines. Hold positions. Wait for the signal. Don't waste your shot. The arquebusiers gripped their weapons and tried to calculate distance, knowing they'd have maybe one chance before the French cavalry reached the earthworks. The pikemen braced their weapons and prepared to receive the charge. And every man along the defensive line understood that the next few minutes would determine whether Gonzalo's new tactics worked or whether they'd all die, proving that old methods still dominated warfare. The French cavalry broke into a canter. The distance closed. 400 yards. 300. The sound intensified, becoming something physical, a pressure in the chest. French lances came down into the attack position. The riders leaned forward. And the charge that was supposed to shatter the Spanish defense and win the battle in one overwhelming surge of armored might began its final acceleration toward those modest earthworks outside Cerignola. The first Spanish cannon fired when the French cavalry reached 200 yards. The shot was high, sailing harmlessly over the charging horsemen, but the sound and smoke created exactly the effect Gonzalo wanted. Horses shied. Riders fought to keep their mounts under control. The perfect formation began to waver, just slightly, as individual horses reacted to the noise with their own flight instincts. This was the artillery's real purpose in early 16th century warfare, not to kill efficiently but to disrupt, to create fractional moments of chaos that other weapons could exploit. At 100 yards, the Spanish arquebusiers could see individual faces. The distance closed fast. 70 yards. 60. The cavalry were committed now, locked into the charge, unable to stop or turn away without creating worse disaster. 50 yards. The earthworks that had seemed insignificant from a distance suddenly loomed larger. A 6-foot ditch with a corresponding rampart created a 12-foot obstacle. Not impossible for horses to cross, but impossible to cross at speed, impossible to cross in formation. The leading French riders would have to slow, find their footing, negotiate the obstacle. And that's when they would be most vulnerable. Gonzalo's voice carried across the Spanish line. Fire! 1,300 arquebusiers discharged almost simultaneously. The sound wasn't a single thunderclap but a rolling wave of individual explosions that blended into one continuous roar. Smoke immediately obscured the Spanish position, thick white clouds that would take minutes to clear in the still morning air. The arquebusiers couldn't see what they'd hit. They simply followed their training, stepping back from the earthwork's edge to reload, fingers working through practice motions even as their ears rang and their eyes watered from smoke. But you could hear the impact. Horses screamed. Men shouted. The charging cavalry that had seemed unstoppable seconds before suddenly became a confused mass. Arquebus balls at this range, fired in massed volleys into dense formations, didn't need precision to be deadly. Contemporary ballistics analysis, studied by military historians like Bert Hall, shows that early arquebus balls were large-caliber lead projectiles that caused massive tissue damage. A hit anywhere on a horse could bring it down. A hit to an unarmored section of a rider could kill or cripple. And 1,300 shots fired into perhaps 500 charging horsemen meant dozens of hits, maybe more. The first wave of French cavalry hit the earthworks in complete disarray. Some horses tried to jump the ditch and failed, tumbling forward and throwing their riders. Others stopped at the edge, creating obstacles for the riders behind who couldn't see what was happening through the dust and smoke. A few actually made it across, but these isolated riders found themselves in the Spanish position without support, surrounded by pikemen who pulled them from their horses and killed them with brutal efficiency. And then the Spanish arquebusiers fired again. They hadn't had time for a full reload, but Gonzalo had positioned his gun-armed infantry in multiple ranks. While the front rank reloaded, a second rank stepped forward and discharged their weapons into the mass of confused cavalry still trying to navigate the earthworks. This was the tactical innovation that Gonzalo had developed through years of experience, rotating fire, creating sustained volleys rather than single devastating shots followed by long vulnerable pauses. As historian Geoffrey Parker notes, this technique would become standard in European warfare within a generation, but at Cerignola it was still experimental, still being proven in blood. The Duke of Nemours, Louis d'Armagnac, died somewhere in this opening chaos. Contemporary accounts disagree on exactly how. Some say an arquebus ball struck him in the throat. Others suggest he was pulled from his horse and killed by Spanish infantry. The chronicler Paolo Giovio, writing shortly after the battle based on eyewitness testimony, describes the Duke falling in the first assault, though he doesn't specify the cause. What matters is that within minutes of the charge beginning, the French army's commander was dead. This wasn't just a tactical loss. In Renaissance warfare, commanders led from the front. Their presence held armies together. Their death often meant immediate collapse of command structure and morale. But the French didn't collapse immediately. They were too committed, too professional, too convinced of their own superiority. The cavalry kept trying to force their way across the earthworks. Some succeeded, creating small breaches in the Spanish line that had to be sealed by pikemen and sword-armed infantry fighting at close quarters. These isolated melees were vicious. Men stabbed and hacked at each other from inches away. Blood made footing treacherous. The wounded who fell were trampled by their own comrades trying to advance or retreat. Behind the shattered cavalry, the Swiss pikemen advanced. These men had watched the cavalry charge fail, had seen their own duke killed, but they came forward anyway because that's what Swiss infantry did. Their reputation and their entire military culture was built on never retreating, never breaking formation, never showing fear. The pike square that advanced toward the Spanish earthworks numbered perhaps 3,000 men, moving in perfect formation despite what they'd just witnessed. 18-foot pikes held at precise angles. Drums beating the cadence. Officers shouting commands to maintain alignment. Gonzalo watched them come and made a critical decision. The arquebusiers had done their work against the cavalry. Against the pike square, they would be less effective. Pikes could reach across the earthworks. Dense infantry formations could cross the ditch by sheer pressure of numbers, the front ranks forced forward by those behind even if they wanted to stop. So Gonzalo ordered his own pikemen forward to meet the Swiss at the earthwork line. This would be decided by cold steel and physical strength. The two pike formations collided with a sound like a forest falling. Thousands of wooden shafts crashed together. Men in the front ranks pushed with their shoulders and feet, trying to drive their pikes into enemy bodies while preventing enemy pikes from reaching them. The physical strain was enormous. A pike square fought as much with mass and momentum as with individual weapons. Men in the rear ranks shoved forward, adding their weight to the formation. Men in the front ranks couldn't retreat even if they wanted to because the pressure from behind was too great. This kind of combat was grinding, exhausting, and produced casualties at a horrific rate. The Spanish arquebusiers, now reloaded, moved to the flanks of the pike engagement. From slightly elevated positions and protected by their own infantry, they began firing into the sides of the Swiss formation. This was where firearms proved their worth against pike squares. The Swiss formation was designed to present a wall of pikes to any frontal threat. But its flanks and rear were more vulnerable, especially to weapons that could strike from a distance. Arquebus balls smashed into Swiss soldiers who couldn't defend themselves without breaking formation. And breaking formation meant death, because the pike square's entire defensive concept depended on maintaining density and cohesion. The Swiss pushed forward anyway. They'd been in situations like this before, had taken casualties and kept fighting, had broken through enemy lines through sheer determination. But something was different here. The combination of earthworks, sustained arquebus fire, and Spanish pike resistance created a tactical situation the Swiss couldn't overcome through traditional methods. Men in the front ranks were dying faster than they could be replaced. The formation began to compress as casualties mounted. And compressed formations meant less room to maneuver pikes, which meant less effective combat power. You could smell the battle now. Gunpowder smoke mixed with blood and the contents of pierced intestines. The earth around the earthworks was churned into mud from thousands of feet and the blood that soaked into it. Men who'd been fighting for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 or 40 minutes were already exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried them through the initial clash was burning off, leaving behind raw physical fatigue. Arms ached from wielding weapons. Legs trembled from maintaining balance on broken ground. Throats were raw from shouting commands or screaming in pain or rage. The French and Swiss infantry were still fighting hard, still believing they could break through. But the momentum had shifted. What should have been a quick, overwhelming victory was turning into a grinding stalemate. And stalemates favored the defender. Gonzalo's forces were behind prepared positions, fighting with clear objectives and unified command. The French were attacking across broken ground, had lost their overall commander, and were discovering that their traditional tactical advantages weren't working against these new defensive arrangements. The battle was far from over, but the character of it had been established in those first violent minutes. This wouldn't be won by cavalry shock or Swiss pike supremacy. It would be decided by whoever could maintain cohesion and fighting strength while their enemy broke apart. The breaking point came not from a single dramatic moment but from accumulation. Small failures compounding into systemic collapse. The French and Swiss infantry had been fighting for over an hour, pushing against Spanish positions that refused to break. Every time they seemed to gain ground, Spanish pikemen would counterattack or arquebusiers would fire another volley that forced them back. Casualties mounted steadily. The dead and wounded created obstacles that disrupted formations. Men stepped on their own fallen comrades, tripped over bodies, lost cohesion in the chaos. And then the French army started to realize something terrible. They were losing. Not in the glorious way where brave men died in heroic charges. They were being ground down, killed methodically by an enemy they couldn't effectively engage. The earthworks that had seemed like a minor obstacle were functioning as Gonzalo intended, breaking up attacks, protecting his infantry, creating killing zones where firearms could be reloaded and fired repeatedly into targets that couldn't effectively strike back. The Swiss pike formation, that formation which had dominated European battlefields for decades, began to waver. Men in the rear ranks could see what those in front couldn't. The attack was failing. The front ranks were being destroyed without making meaningful progress. And Swiss military culture, for all its emphasis on never retreating, couldn't overcome the basic human survival instinct when confronted with pointless death. Some men began to edge backward. Others simply stopped pushing forward. The formation's density, which had been its strength, now became a liability as confused soldiers tried to move in different directions simultaneously. Gonzalo saw it happening. The moment when an organized enemy force stops being an army and starts becoming a crowd. He'd been holding his cavalry in reserve for exactly this moment. Now he committed them. The Spanish horse, perhaps 800 riders, weren't equipped to break Swiss pike squares through frontal assault. But they didn't need to. They attacked the flanks and rear formations that were already disintegrating, cutting down men who'd broken ranks, pursuing soldiers who'd started to run. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. The sight of enemy cavalry operating freely meant the battle was over. It meant your own forces no longer controlled the space. It meant death was coming from directions you couldn't defend against. The French army broke. Not all at once, but in cascading waves as individual units realized that staying meant dying and that their comrades were already fleeing. The Swiss, those proud infantry who'd built their reputation on never running, ran. They threw down their pikes because 18-foot weapons were impossible to carry at speed. They abandoned wounded comrades because stopping to help meant being caught by Spanish cavalry. The transformation from disciplined military force to panicked mob took minutes. The pursuit became a slaughter. Spanish cavalry hunted fleeing French soldiers across the countryside around Cerignola. Men who'd fought bravely an hour before now died helplessly, cut down from behind while trying to escape. Others surrendered, dropping to their knees and begging for mercy that was sometimes granted and sometimes not. Renaissance warfare operated on complex codes about ransom and prisoner treatment, but those codes often dissolved in the immediate aftermath of battle when blood was up and soldiers sought revenge for fallen comrades. Contemporary estimates of French casualties vary wildly, as they always do in pre-modern battles. The chronicler Francesco Guicciardini, writing a generation later but drawing on contemporary sources, suggests around 4,000 French and Allied soldiers died at Cerignola. Modern historians like Michael Mallet consider this plausible, though perhaps slightly high. What's certain is that French losses were catastrophic while Spanish casualties were relatively light, perhaps a few hundred dead and wounded. This disparity tells you everything about what happened. The French lost the battle not because they lacked courage or numbers or quality troops, but because they attacked into defensive positions that negated their advantages and amplified their vulnerabilities. The battlefield after combat ended was a study in human cost. Thousands of bodies lay scattered across the vineyard and surrounding fields. The earthworks were piled with French and Swiss dead who'd fallen trying to cross them. Wounded men cried out for water or help or simply cried. Civilians from Cerignola and nearby villages began to appear, some to loot the dead, others to search for family members who'd been pressed into military service. The distinction between noble cavalry and common soldiers disappeared in death. Expensive armor lay broken beside simple cloth tunics. Blood soaked into Italian earth that would grow wine grapes again within a few years, the battle remembered only in local stories and official histories. Gonzalo Fernandez de Cordoba walked the battlefield as evening approached, doing what successful commanders did after victory. He ensured the wounded received treatment, at least those who could be saved. He organized the burial details that would spend days disposing of thousands of corpses before disease spread. He sent dispatches to Spain informing Ferdinand and Isabella that their army had won a decisive victory and that Naples was secure. And he thought about what this battle meant, not just politically but militarily. Because Cerignola had proven something that would reshape European warfare. Properly prepared defensive positions, combined with coordinated infantry and sustained firearm volleys, could defeat cavalry and pike formations that had dominated battlefields for generations. This wasn't immediately obvious to everyone who studied the battle. Conservative military thinkers would continue to emphasize cavalry shock and pike square tactics for decades. But the seeds of change had been planted. As historian Jeremy Black notes in his analysis of the military revolution, battles like Cerignola demonstrated that technological and tactical innovations could overcome traditional advantages of numbers, equipment quality, and troop reputation. The political consequences were immediate and significant. The Battle of Cerignola effectively ended French hopes of controlling Naples. Without the army that had been destroyed outside this small Italian town, France couldn't maintain military pressure in southern Italy. Spain consolidated control over Naples and would hold it for the next 2 centuries. The balance of power in Italy shifted decisively toward Spanish interests. And Gonzalo's reputation was sealed. El Gran Capitan became one of the most celebrated military commanders of his era, studied by officers seeking to understand how warfare was changing. But there's something else worth understanding about Cerignola, something that goes beyond tactics and politics. This battle represented a moment when the human experience of warfare fundamentally shifted. For centuries, European combat had been dominated by personal courage and physical strength. Knights in armor, trained from childhood, fought face-to-face with other warriors of similar skill. There was brutality and death, but also a kind of comprehensible logic to it. The better fighter, the braver soldier, the stronger army usually won. Cerignola pointed toward a different future. A future where anonymous soldiers with firearms could kill armored nobles from a distance. Where properly organized defensive positions mattered more than individual heroism. Where battles were decided by logistics, engineering, and coordination rather than just courage and steel. The medieval world of chivalry and personal combat was giving way to something more modern, more impersonal, more industrial in its approach to organized violence. The men who died in that vineyard on April 28, 1503, were transitional figures. They trained and fought using methods inherited from the Middle Ages, but they died in a battle that prefigured modern warfare. The Duke of Nemours and thousands of French soldiers learned too late that the old certainties no longer applied, that cavalry charges couldn't overcome prepared positions with firearms, that reputation and courage weren't enough against enemies who'd developed new tactical systems. As the sun set over Cerignola that evening, the smoke finally cleared. The sounds of battle faded into the quieter sounds of aftermath, moaning wounded, burial parties at work, victorious soldiers celebrating survival. The vineyard would recover. The town would rebuild whatever damage it had suffered. Life would continue. But warfare had changed. The future had announced itself in volleys of arquebus fire and the screams of dying horses and the collapse of French cavalry before earthworks that would have been irrelevant a generation earlier. Medieval warfare died at Cerignola. What replaced it would dominate European battlefields for the next 3 centuries, an age of gunpowder and fortification and organized infantry that could stand against any charge, no matter how brave or determined. The great captain had shown the way forward. And the men who died proving his tactics worked had paid the price for that knowledge with their blood and lives and futures that would never come.